Very good evening to all of you. On behalf of Committee for Members in Practice of Institute of Chartered Accountant of India, I welcome you all in this VCM on export incentives under GST and overview of auditor's report and standards on auditing. In order to tackle these two topics, we are having with our eminent personalities, eminent speakers, Shri Bipin Sapraji as well as CA Pranav Jainji with us. On behalf of CMP of ICI, I welcome you, Bipin Sapraji. Welcome you, CA Pranav Jainji. Welcome. So let us start our today's VCM. The first topic which we are going to start is the export incentives under GST, the various current issues. And for this, we are having with us Shri Bipin Sapraji. Bipin ji is a partner in Indian Indirect Tax Practice of Ernst & Young. Prior to joining EY in 2007, he was an officer of Indian Revenue Services in India for last 15 years. He has more than 29 years of experience in wide range of subjects including GST, transition planning and implementation, indirect tax policy planning and solutions, especially in the area of technology, e-commerce, telecom, travel and logistics services. Bipin has been involved in the policy formulation as part of various committees of Central Board of Excise and Customs for drafting legislation and also as a member of the Task Force of Tax Administration Reforms Commission. Bipin ji received his Masters in Public Policy from University of Chicago in 2003, in addition to the Masters in Technology 1991 and Bachelor in Technology 1990 from Indian Institute of Technology, IIT, Delhi. So the list is long. Without wasting much more time, may I request Bipin ji to please start his deliberation and enlighten all of us on the various intricacies as well as the various export incentives under GST. Bipin sir.
Thank you, Ji. Thank you for inviting me here. It's always a pleasure to come and speak here on this forum. It's such a huge platform where you can communicate your views and pass on whatever bit of knowledge we have acquired over the years to the CAs out there. Let me just put up my slide deck. I hope everybody can see that.
Yes, sir, it's visible.
Yes.
Fine, sir.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Okay. To give a brief background, and I'm just assuming that most of you are aware how the goods and service tax is working here in India. My choice of this subject comes from I worked extensively in the field of export incentives under GST, and prior to that under service tax, and hence wanted to share that part of that part of my knowledge here. Exports and export incentives under goods is a very well-developed area, and over the last more than 2 to 3 decades, export incentives under goods, whether through excise or VAT, has been a clear area of under which a lot of measures have been done, either through excise exemptions, giving treatment of export of services, export of goods. Similarly, for VAT, there were a lot of benefits and exemptions under the VAT regime. Customs provides various incentives for export of goods, and whether it's in the form of advanced licensing, EPCG, a number of benefits which are there. However, services over a period of time started receiving incentives only primarily once service tax came in. Prior to that, only EPCG was one scheme where some benefits were available under the export incentives. Under the service tax, because services were being charged to GST, and there was a clear credit mechanism also there, export incentives became a norm, and the export incentives by way of refunds, by way of zero rating, became a norm. Yeah. Now, the same has really carried forward in case of GST. Most of the benefits which were available in service tax have been carried forward in GST, because essentially service tax was something on which most of the places VAT was not being charged. And accordingly, whatever law developed in GST, most of the issues in service tax were carried forward. What you have to realize is that ultimately, and you would have seen that the goods and services have been treated globally in various regimes also differently. I just want to mention that here because that will form, that will give you a basic understanding as to why export incentives and the services are so crucial for us, and as compared to export incentives and the goods, they are also important, but goods have a different status as compared to services globally also. So the WTO regime, which was there, has had various deliberations, and there are various restrictions which have been placed on giving incentives in case of export of goods. We had recent filings, and whatever benefits have been given by India have been challenged. US had filed an appeal against the benefits or the incentives which India was giving, and that appeal was upheld by US by WTO, and accordingly, number of benefits which were being provided by India to the exporters has now been really being relooked. In that light, services do not have any restriction. While there is a general agreement on trade in services, which is known as GATS, GATT for goods and GATT for GATS for services. The export incentives which can be given on services are immense, and there is no stopping or no restriction on the incentives which can be given. That's the broad thought process under which export incentives under services are being framed. What also needs to be realized is that the basic principle, whenever a GST or a VAT law is drafted worldwide, is that whenever goods or services are being exported, you export them without any tax from that originating country. If at all they are going to be taxed, they are going to be taxed in the country where it is finally going to be consumed. So like in India, if the goods are being imported, we pay customs duty, we pay GST, IGST, because we are consuming here, and accordingly, the Indian tax is being paid here. Similarly, when services are being imported into India, we pay tax under the GST under the reverse charge mechanism, and it is being taxed here. The exporting country should not be taxing it. That is the basic principle on which export of services works. And that is why it has been given a zero rating status. When we say a zero rating status, what essentially it means is that the output or the output supply of the service is not being taxed, and any tax on the input side is also being refunded to the exporter. Accordingly, the entire supply has no tax component from India. If at all it gets taxed, it will be taxed in the destination state, either under the reverse charge mechanism or any other mechanism that a country prescribes. So in GST, we have two mechanisms. One is export of services without payment of tax under the letter of undertaking. And so on the output side, so you have to look at it from a perspective that the export, when the service is being supplied outside India or is being exported outside India, and it is export, and we'll talk about what conditions would lead to an export of service going forward. But if it is export, then you have two options. You either do not pay a tax and claim the refund of input credit on the whatever input supplies have come in on which have incurred an input tax. It could be a IGST, CGST, SGST, or you export with payment of tax and claim a refund of that tax. So those are the two broad mechanisms under which the benefit of zero rating works. I hope this is clear, but I'll just explain it once again. I think I was not exactly that clear. So if you see the diagram, how do the refund claims work? In case of, if you look at the first box on the top, you do not pay tax. You do not pay any IGST, and IGST we say because it's going outside the country with supply, so it will always be an IGST. If at all there is a tax, you file a letter of undertaking with the government saying that in case this is not exported, I'll pay the tax. On the basis of that undertaking, the government will allow you to export without payment of tax. And then on the input side, they have created a mechanism by which all refund of accumulated input tax credit would be granted to you. This is for services, and this is also for goods. On the second side, you see on the bottom portion, you'll see the supply has been made on payment of IGST on exports. And once that has been done, you claim a refund of that IGST. Now, these are two mechanisms. Why would somebody choose one mechanism over the other? I would have actually wanted it allowed to have an interactive session, but given the volume of people there and the mechanisms there, I think I'll only have to go ahead and answer these questions. See, in case where you have opening balances, accumulation of credit on the past, which have not been able to, you have not been able to obtain a refund of the services, a refund of those input credits, or you are seeking a refund of taxes on capital goods. Now, capital goods is not something on which normally refund is allowed under this mechanism. Refund capital goods, you can take credit and utilize it for payment of any other tax if you have a local liability. But here, if you use the second mechanism, you can use that to pay IGST on exports. So any let me step back a little. In the first instance, when you have exported the service without payment of tax under the letter of undertaking, and you file a refund of accumulated ITC, that the ITC, the refund which is granted is of only that input tax credit which you have received in that particular month. Opening balances and closing opening balances, or what we have carried forward, generally the refund does not include in its calculation, and we'll talk about the calculation a little later. But in case of second option, if you have a lot of credit which has been accumulated from the past, it could be at the time of transition, it could be a one-time exercise where you have sold a company or bought a company, and because of that, a credit has got accumulated. You use that credit to pay your taxes and claim a refund. The second part, what we colloquially know as the rebate on exports, is sometimes quite a simple mechanism, and there are certain circulars which do not allow the department to really go back and look at what type of credit you have accumulated. in practice, they may choose to seek that. But on a lot of practical cases, we see they do not check that, and they have to grant refund, given that all refund processes are now online, and hence it becomes simpler to pay the tax and avail the credit. Pay the tax and avail the refund. Now, the question which arises is that you may have an LUT, and you may choose to not use that LUT in a particular month, because ultimately what happens? The credit is only 20 to 30% of your total liability. The remaining liability, if you start paying in cash, if you start paying for 1 month or for a particular part of a month, then there might be cash liabilities also coming in, which you would not want to happen, because then effectively you will be blocking your cash flow and for a period of some months, and then getting the refund back. So you only want to pay tax on the exports, which is equivalent to the accumulated credit. And you have to realize that, and these are settled laws. There might be disputes, but there are settled case laws that for each invoice, you can take a view that whether it's you want to do it under LUT, or you want to do it on payment of IGST on exports. So accordingly, you can, on a part month or the full month, you can use it to pay the tax and claim a refund. I'm stressing on the second part because this is a lot of people do not use this mechanism, but it's quite simple and quite handy. If you have questions, hold the questions till the end. I would love to come back and discuss this in more detail, if at all the clarity has not been received. Okay, so these are the two mechanisms. The aim is that the supply which is going from here to outside India, there is no tax on that. That is the basic incentive which the government provides to an exporter of service. Now let's get to the mechanism which is out there. Now we talked about a zero rating of the supply. What you have to realize is that the zero rating is being provided under the IGST Act. The section 16 of IGST Act talks about that two supplies are zero rated. I spoke about zero rating. It's basically that the output is not taxed, and the input is there is no input. Whatever taxes you have paid on the input side, you get a refund of that. Please remember, this is not an exemption. It's a zero rating of the supply. Exemptions do not allow you to take credits. Zero rating allows you to take credit and file for the refund. That's the difference, and please, that's a thing which we should remember it always. So two types of supplies have been classified as zero rated. One is export of goods or services, or both. And the second is supplies to special economic zone unit. So any supplier from a domestic area to a special SEZ would be also treated as a zero rated supplier. We won't talk about that too much here. Maybe at the very fag end, we have one issue which I wanted to highlight. We'll talk about that there. But till then, we'll keep our discussion mainly on the export of services. Section 54 of the CGST Act is the enabling section for refunds. It provides for the refund of unutilized input tax credit for zero-rated supply of goods, inverted duty structures, and other refunds like excess tax paid. So that's the thing. We are only interested right now in the zero-rated supplies, and the good thing is that there is now a 60-day timeline which has been fixed, where the refund should be granted within the 60 days of receipt of application. Most of the places, there is a lot of pressure to adhere to this timeline, and it is being adhered to also. A lot of places you may see some deficiency memos being issued, but that's fine. But broadly, the government has made an effort that this be given within 60 days. There's also a principle, I hope you are aware of unjust enrichment. What unjust enrichment means is that if I have a refund to file, if I have paid a tax and I have paid the tax wrongly, then I can file a refund with the government. But the government will check that I have not paid the tax and collected it from my consumer. If I have already collected it from my consumer, then the government will hold that this is unjust enrichment and I should not be refunded that amount. That amount should be paid to a consumer welfare fund. So that's the basis. But in case of export, that doesn't apply. So what you can do is, if you have paid a tax, so and that is generally it can happen that say an IT/ITeS company working on a cost plus basis, when you pay the tax initially, that becomes a cost in that particular month. You collect that from your overseas from the overseas entity, yet you file a refund. Now, technically, what would happen is that this would become an unjust enrichment if it was not for export of goods. But here the government holds that this is not unjust enrichment and the refund would be granted. Practically, what would happen is that for that company, because it's again a cost plus setup, this will reduce the cost in that coming month. So effectively, there will be no unjust enrichment. But if the company so chooses not to reduce the cost, then also there is no repercussion on the company. So this is an important point. Please always remember, in case of export of goods or services, refunds would be granted and there is no unjust enrichment involved. Okay. Now we come to the point where what constitutes an export of service. Export of goods is simple. It's taking of goods out of India to a place outside India. Very simple. We may have a more technical definition somewhere, but this is as simple as this it is, and this is what the definition of in GST says. In case of export of services, there is a much more complex definition, and the reason is that services are intangible. They are prone to misuse, round tripping, and a lot of other issues which the government has to safeguard against. So 5 conditions. The first is that the exporter of service is located in India. So location of service provider in India. The second condition is recipient of service is located outside India. So service recipient outside India. We have a detailed definition of location of service provider and service recipient. I'm not going there at the moment because of paucity of time. We want to discuss certain issues. So, but you have a broad understanding because those are basic issues. The third is the place of supply of services outside India. Now, this is very important and a crucial point. Place of supply of service, I hope most of you are aware, but even for those who are not aware, there are certain conditions or certain rules which have been laid down, which define as to how a service would be considered as where the service would be, where the place of supply of that service would be considered. And most of these have been taken from globally accepted place of supply rules in various VAT jurisdictions. In India, we differentiate between place of supplies when the supplier and recipient are in India, but we and for those where either of these two is outside India. So even if the like provider of service is outside India and the recipient is in India, a different set of rules will apply. Or as in our case, where we are dealing in export of services, the exporter is in India, and the recipient is located outside India. Then a certain different set of place of supply rules arise. Very broadly, and these are the same rules in service tax. So very similar rules in service tax. So you would be aware, but very broadly, the default place of supply is for all services is where the recipient is located. The services where the place of supply is different are in relation to goods, any supply being provided, so transportation of goods, clearance of goods, cargo handling or other places. That would be the place of supply would be where the supply is being done, or then event management, or services in relation to a immovable property. All of these services, the place of supply would be where either the event is there or the building is there. So a large number of rules. I'm not going there again, but essentially they lay down as to where the service is being supplied. It doesn't mean performance; it means supplied, because if the service exporter is here, it will always be performed from here. But the place of supply can be outside India. So I am providing a consulting service to my client in US. I will always be writing, I'll be using my head, I'll be using my team here. I'll be providing a memo, which I'll send it out by an email to them. Performance is here, but the supply is outside India, because that's what the rules provide. So please do not confuse between performance and the place of supply. In certain cases, the two may be same, like in case of logistic services or the cargo handling, things like that. But otherwise, they would be different. They may or may not be same. The fourth condition is the payment of such service has been received by the supplier service in convertible foreign exchange or in Indian rupees wherever permitted by RBI. This is simple. And finally, the supplier of service and the recipient of service are not merely establishments of a distinct person. Very simply put, they are not branch and head offices. The government does not want to provide a benefit to such people, because it's very difficult to measure what service is being provided between a branch and a head office. Hold on to that thought. We have a bigger discussion at the end, and accordingly, we'll discuss this then. Very quickly, how do we calculate the refund? You might have had a class on this, so I won't really go there. That's not my intention today. The refund amount is calculated on the basis of the turnover of the zero-rated supply upon the adjusted total turnover into the net ITC. And all of these three are defined and given in the law. I again do not want to talk in detail, except that the zero-rated supplies to be considered in the numerator are supplies for which payment has been received in a particular the period in which we are talking about. So this is basically the refund calculation. Like talking about these calculations itself, there are a large number of nuances around the refund amount. Hold on to that. If there are any specific questions, I'll deal with it at the end. But that I'm just trying to move on and talk about the issues which I have today wanted to talk about. The relevant date is 2 years from the export of services, which is the date of payment, receipt of payment of exports, or invoice date in case of advance payment. Basically, export of services, you have to realize is whenever those 5 conditions get fulfilled, that is the date on which is the relevant date. It would be the last thing which normally would come is after the service has been provided. So you know whether service provider is, service recipient is, place of supply is, and whether the payment has been received in foreign exchange or not would be when the foreign exchange is received. And hence, that is the case. However, if it's an advance payment, then the invoice date, because invoices would always generally be after the service has been provided. It could be after the advance also, but then that would be the date on which we would consider it as provided, the service provided. So these are the basic issues out there. Periodicity is, it can be 1 month, quarter, or you could club months and quarters and years and file a single refund. Not talking too much about the procedure. No CA certificate is required. It used to be required earlier and in service tax, but it's not required. This I would mention that there's a concept of filing of deficiency memo. So what the department does is, and it's inbuilt into the system and part of the law, that if there is a deficiency in your memo, in your refund filing, they'll issue you a deficiency memo, and it would be tantamount to returning the file. You'll have to, whenever you file, you'll have to file it afresh, and it should be within time. And they cannot issue you more than 1 or 2 deficiency memos. So those are the nuances which need to be kept in mind, but we're not talking about procedures of refunds. My aim today is that, having given you that background, we talk about certain issues which have been plaguing the exporter of services. So what you have to realize is that there are 2 benefits which the exporter of services really get. One is the refund, and second is the SEIS benefit, or Service Export from India scheme. And SEIS is operated by the Ministry of Commerce. They decide. And there also, there are problems, issues in getting those scripts. Going forward, only certain services would be allowed. But here, export of service refunds is one thing which all service exporters hope to get, and any issue which stops those really challenges their all the export benefits and the fact that they have been set up in India. And our economy, as everybody is aware, has benefited a lot from the IT/ITES service sector. And they are the backbone of providing these services from here. So I want to take up 3 issues today very quickly. First is the intermediary services. Some of you may be aware, it's not a new concept which is out there. It's a concept which is there from earlier days. People who have been practicing for a long time would remember that in service tax, there used to be a concept of business auxiliary services, like commission agents, procuring agents. Their business auxiliary services, the place of supply was where the recipient was. So their export was not a problem till 2011. In 2011, place of supply rules came from for service tax. And then now in GST, similar rules have been carried forward where the intermediary was defined. So what's an intermediary, and why is there? And I don't know whether you heard this time's press briefing of the GST Council or read any of that. Intermediary was one major issue which we have been pressurizing the government to issue a clarification on. And they have now finalized a clarification, which should be out in the public domain in the next few days. So what's an intermediary? Intermediary is a broker, an agent, or any other person who arranges or facilitates the supply of goods or services between 2 or more persons. Very important definition. You have to realize that, and I'll tell you why this is important. If somebody is considered an intermediary, then the place of supply is where the service provider is located, and hence it will not be treated as an export of service. That is, there is a specific rule out there, and that causes the biggest problems. The problem here is that it's a very wide definition. So a broker, an agent, or any other person, we just take any other person who arranges or facilitates the supply of goods or services between 2 or more persons. Now, arranges or facilitates is a very, very wide connotation, and given the variety of business models out there, there have been large number of disputes and large number of issues in this area. I'll give you a classic example for those who don't understand intermediary or they haven't really dealt with an intermediary. An intermediary, the classic example is a commission agent or an Aadhatiya, which we understand in our common parlance. So just consider that, say, Philips India or any other company appoints a commission agent here in India, saying that you will be responsible for selling to maybe wholesale parties, or you will be selling to individual people or whatever. Now, the person gets its remuneration on the basis of a commission of what he sells. The sale takes place between Philips and, say, the Indian buyer. The commission agent is identifying the buyer, facilitating the supply, negotiating the price, and finally fixing, if at all is, if it's not negotiation, then it would be signing the contract or the PO or other things, and really making that supply happen. He's a true intermediary between the buyer and the seller, and hence when he builds the overseas entity, Philips, he would be treated as an intermediary, and he'll have to charge a GST. So that GST then becomes a cost in this transaction, because Philips International cannot take a credit of that. They do not have a supply here in India on which they can take a credit. They are not registered. Their Indian entity might be registered. And this is just a hypothetical example. It could be Philips, it could be XYZ or anybody else. So that's a commission agent. Similarly, there could be a procurement agent, a textile mill outside or a textile company outside India is wanting to source yarn or the grey cloth from India, get somebody in Ahmedabad to be the procuring agent for them, who looks out, finds the person, and settles the deal, negotiates the price on behalf of the overseas partner, and helps in shipping out the goods. Classic case of intermediary. So where is the problem? Problem comes in where these classic cases do not exist. And that's where in case of IT/ITeS services, where there are two people who are doing marketing services. The IT company here is doing a marketing services, or doing outsourced services, and hence they have been treated as intermediaries while they were actually not, and there has been a lot of disputes there. Since we are running short of time, I'll very quickly move on to the next slide and basically give you a history of 3 very important judgments, which will help you really analyze as to what we are talking about. And I'll take questions on that later. In service tax, there was a case of GoDaddy India web services. GoDaddy was providing marketing services, basically branding activities, supervision of quality of third-party customer care center, and payment processing services. It was a cost plus markup supply. There was disputes, and finally in the advance ruling, it was held that since it was being provided on a principal-to-principal basis, that GoDaddy India was providing services to the overseas customer on a principal-to-principal basis without 3 parties being involved. This would be, even though it was a marketing service, they were not really getting into the negotiating stage with the customer. They were just identifying where all maybe GoDaddy overseas could go to, or briefing the customers on that. It would be this would not be an intermediary, and it was treated as export. So service tax was broadly guided by these advanced rulings, and similarly tribunal gave some positive judgments, and the issue was not that great. However, when GST came in, we had a triple AR ruling, or the Appellate Advanced Authority ruling, which really turned the tables. And we felt it was providing back office and account support to overseas entity. The case facts which the authority interpreted was that it was facilitating the supply of goods and doing the work on behalf of their clients. And accordingly, they held that this was intermediary. And this has really turned the tables in the GST regime, and we see a lot of litigation happening here and the funds being rejected. Very interestingly, there is a very interesting case going on in the Bombay High Court in case of Dharmendra M. Jani versus Union of India, where the basic constitutionality of this intermediary has been challenged. It was before the two-judge bench, and there were conflicting judgments. So at least one of them held that you cannot impose a tax on export of services by way of an intermediary, and held it to be unconstitutional. It has been referred to a third member, and we are awaiting finality. So very interesting regime right now, but a lot of problems, and refunds were not coming. So because of that, and the government initially issued a circular. That circular caused more problems. It was withdrawn. So the last 1.5, 2 years have been years where there has been confusion, interpretations on the basis. Each officer has taken his own interpretation, and now finally the GST Council has recognized the importance of this, and in the last meeting held on 17th, has probably accepted. So they have said that they are issuing a clarification on intermediary issue. Our fingers are crossed that it is a good clarification, and no further issue is that this issue, at least from an interpretation basis, is set to rest. That's intermediary broadly. The second issue, which is also being, so remember that we had five points here. The fifth was supplier of a service and the recipient of service are not merely establishments of a distinct person. This issue has been raked up and has been causing a lot of rejection among the various things. So what essentially is that the overseas entity and the Indian entity are generally subsidiaries, but they are separate legal entities in their own rights. They are not branches. Even then, the department has been holding that these are merely establishments of a distinct person. Whatever the FAQs came in initially, it was being held that the intention of this being kept was that the branch and a head office will not be able to get the benefit. They will be establishments of a distinct person, but two separate legal entities. Even if they have it's a 100% holding company or a 100% subsidiary, then also it will not be a distinct person. Will be held to be a distinct person. And this confusion has again been set to rest, and the government has finally clarified or is going to clarify after this GST Council that that in such a case where a person who has been incorporated in India under Companies Act 2013 and the person incorporated under the laws of any other country are to be treated as separate legal entities, and even though if they have a common shareholding. So that would hopefully put to rest a lot of litigation which was happening earlier. And the last issue, very quickly, I don't think we have too much of time out here, but this is basically on SEZ rules. So you will realize that the SEZ and so whenever goods are being supplied to an SEZ, that's zero rating. And when SEZ is supplying whenever goods services are being supplied to an SEZ, that is zero rated. Whenever the SEZ is supplying the services to outside India, that is also zero rated. In the first option, if somebody actually decides to pay, use the second option, pay the tax, and there is an understanding with the SEZ unit that the SEZ unit will reimburse that payment, the SEZ unit can then take credit and file a refund. There is no debar out there that SEZ unit cannot act like a normal unit. However, there have been a lot of disputes around this, and we were hoping that a clarification on that would also come out. But ultimately, that issue continues to be an issue, and various jurisdictions taking various views. But ultimately, whether an SEZ can act as a normal unit and pay the tax, take credit, pay the tax, and claim a refund has been disputed by various authorities. That broadly is what my presentation is. Open to questions.
Sir, there are only one or two questions.
Okay.
One is again they are asking, I hope you have already covered. This is relating to the benefits in the GST to exporters of the service and how to apply GST refund.
Can you repeat that question?
Simple question: how to apply for GST refund and benefits in GST to the exporters of services?
Okay. So the GST refund you can apply online. It's a fully online model, and there's a clear procedure laid down. I'd actually I would not have that. Otherwise, I had really printed down the exact procedure. I would have loved to show that. But it's a simple procedure. You go online, file a refund, and on the basis of that, the authorities, you'll have to upload all the documents, whatever are required. So if it's a input side, you'll have to upload the credit and the other workings. And there's a form on the basis of that, and that refund would then be processed. Either they'll issue you a deficiency memo, no certificates required, no declarations required, simple online filing. They'll either issue a deficiency memo and return that refund, and you'll have to fulfill that and put it back, or they'll grant it within 60 days. So generally within 60 days, you get a refund of that.
Sir, commission received from foreign buyers, GST is applicable. If received as in foreign currency, then not applicable. Is it correct? They are talking about the commission received from the foreign buyers.
No, so it's when you have to realize that it's a commission agent, and a commission agent is an intermediary, and the place of supply will be continue to be India. It will not be treated as export. It will not be material whether the supply is coming in foreign exchange or not. The third condition, that the place of supply should be outside India, is not fulfilled, and hence you'll have to pay tax.
Yes. So another question is whether Indian subsidiary company of a foreign holding company are distinct person, even though both our shareholders are same in both the companies.
So They are distinct persons, but not of this. They are distinct established. They are not distinct establishments of the same company. They are two different companies, 100% subsidiary or the 100% holding also. They would be treated as two separate companies, as independent companies, and any supply between them can be treated as export if all other conditions are fulfilled.
Ji, sir. So what about a situation where an employee is transferred to foreign, that is subsidiary of Indian company, is talking about when an employee is transferred to foreign, when the associate comes to India on vacation and delivers work from India during the extended stay in India, does they consider export from India?
See, these are complex arrangements, and it depends upon the exact arrangement. We see a lot of times that to save tax, there are the dual employment contracts which are generally carried out. It depends upon how the contract has been carried out. So if a person has been sent to US, has been sent to US, and he comes back. Now, if he is an employee of the overseas company and delivering services to them from here, then it will fall under the case of establishments of the distinct entity. So it will be like like same company providing service to each other, and there'll be no export. But if he is being treated as an employee of the Indian entity, then it can be export. So depending upon who's billing for his services and how that is being charged, would decide as to whether money is coming in or not, would decide whether this is export of service. So both are possible.
Fine, sir. So these were the few questions for you for the GST, sir. So on behalf of CMP of ICI, I extend my heartiest thanks for sparing your valuable time, sir, and enlightening all of us on various intricacies on this GST as well as the export incentives under GST. Thank you so much, sir. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Pleasure.
Thanks. Now we have with us CA Pranav Jain ji, and another topic for today's VCM is the overview of auditors' reports and standards on auditing. So, in order to enlighten on this topic, we have the Shri Pranav ji. Pranav ji is a fellow member of ICI with 21 years of experience in audit and assurance, both in India and abroad. He has completed certificate course of ICI on IFRS as well as in the forensic accounting and fraud detection. He is presently senior audit partner with BGJC and Associate LLP and is heading the quality and assurance team of that firm. He is a regular speaker of ICI CP Study Circle and other platforms like PhD Chamber of Commerce in industry. He has also given his presentation on international standards on various international platforms. He is empaneled as a technical reviewer with the Quality Review Board set up by the Government of India and also a member of Financial Reporting Review Group of ICI. He has been the part of various study groups of ICI to develop guidance note, implementation guides, new standards on auditing. He has led audits in listed and unlisted companies and has served domestic, international, and multinational clients operating in diverse sectors like consumer goods, automobile components, telecom, travel, entertainment, EPC, education, among others. He has handled audit both under Indian GAAP and IFRS. And Pranav has also experience of providing IPO advisory services and has worked on ADR issues. And the list is still very big to introduce him. So without wasting much more time, I request sir to please enlighten all of us on this very important topic, auditors' reports and standards on auditing. Pranav ji, please.
Thank you very much for this kind introduction, and thank you for committee members in practice for giving me this opportunity to share my views. Let me share my screen. So is it visible?
Yes, sir. Fine. It's visible, sir.
Okay. This is a time of the year when a lot of audits are being finalized and the auditors are forming an opinion, both for corporate entities and non-corporate entities. So probably this is the right time to have a quick look at the form and structure of auditor's report and the related standards of auditing which affect the auditor's opinion. In the next 45 to 50 minutes, I will try to cover the structure of the audit report, the key aspects of the related standards in auditing, and also try to highlight some of the common issues that we note in during the review of financial statements as part of various review processes that we carry out. So to begin, so what is an audit report? So audit report is basically a written letter of auditor's opinion on whether the entity's financial statements give a true and fair view of the state of affairs, profit or loss, cash flows in accordance with the applicable financial reporting framework. So essentially, audit report is the output of all the audit procedures that an auditor performs. So auditors have the responsibility to obtain sufficient appropriate audit evidence in order to form a basis for opinion on the financial statements. So the key aspects of this part is that there should be an applicable financial reporting framework. When I talk about financial reporting framework, it can be accounting standards notified under the Companies Accounting Standard Rules 2006 or Ind AS or the accounting standards issued by the Institute of Chartered Accountants of India as applicable to a particular entity. And then the next important concept is sufficient appropriate audit evidence. Now, sufficient appropriate audit evidence is the key to form an opinion. So we will see in detail in the subsequent slides how sufficient appropriate audit evidence affects the audit opinion. So let's have a quick look at the various standards on auditing that are applicable as audit reports are concerned. So there are primarily 6 standards which deal with the form and the content of the auditor's opinion and various disclosures that go into the auditor's report. So these are 700, forming an opinion and reporting on the financial statements, 701, which is related to key audit matters, 705, which relates to modification to the opinion in the independent auditor's report, 706 deal with emphasis of matter and other matter paragraphs, 710 deals with revised comparative information, and 720 revised deals with auditor's responsibility in relation to other information in the documents containing audited financial statements. So all these standards on auditing are mandatory. So except 701, which is applicable to only listed entities and other entities in certain cases, which we will discuss a little later. So these standards are applicable on all entities except 720, which is applicable only on corporate entities. So even though these standards are in place for quite some time now, there is still a confusion that many chartered accountants, many practitioners believe that reporting structure given in SA 700 is not applicable to non-corporate entities like LLP or trust or partnership firms, which is wrong. Wherever there's a financial statement and the auditor's report is there, the structure has to be in accordance with 700, and if modification to audit report is required, it has to be in accordance with SA 705. So first, let's look at 700. In some way, it is a mother standard of the auditing report standards because it gives overall structure and format of how to form an opinion and the structure of the audit report that the auditor has to follow. So SA 700 says that the objective of the auditor is the auditor's responsibility to form an opinion on the financial statements. SA 700 provides the form and content of auditor's report issued as a result of the audit of financial statements. SA 700 applies to an audit of a complete set of general purpose financial statements. So when I talk of complete set of financial statement, it would include the balance sheet, profit loss, cash flow, statement of change in equity if applicable, disclosure of accounting policy, other disclosures, and other information that is required pursuant to any law or regulation. So for example, in case of companies, the disclosures required by Schedule 3 have to be included to make it a complete set of financial statements. And the general purpose financial statement means that the financial statements meet the common financial information needs of a wide range of users, such as taxation authorities, shareholders, bankers, potential investors, etc. So let's look a little more in detail in SA 700. It talks about forming an opinion. So to form an opinion, the auditor considers whether the financial statements prepared in all material respects in accordance with the applicable financial reporting framework. So the key word over here is material. So the auditor applies the concept of materiality in making this opinion. Then the auditor concludes whether he has obtained a reasonable assurance whether the financial statements as a whole are free from material misstatement, whether due to fraud or error. The key words over here are reasonable assurance. So reasonable assurance means that it is not an absolute assurance or a guarantee that the financial statements are free from material misstatement. And it is obviously because the auditor performs an audit in accordance with applicable standards on auditing, which require test check basis of auditing, addressing the risk of material misstatement. What is misstatement? So when we talk of misstatement, it is the difference between what there is actually there and what it should be. And when we talk of misstatement, it includes amount, classification, presentation, and disclosure. So to give an example, so let's consider misstatement in amount. So AS2, valuation of inventories, require inventories to be valued at lower of cost and net realizable value. So suppose the inventory is being carried at cost, but there is sufficient evidence to prove that a realizable value is much lower than the cost. So let's say the cost is 100 and the net realizable value is only 50 rupees. So balance sheet records inventory at 100 rupees. So this is the actual that has been recorded, and 50 is what it should be in the financial statements. So the difference between 100 and 50 is the misstatement so far as amounts are concerned. Now, if we talk of misstatement in classification, so for example, take deposits which are having an original maturity of more than 3 months. That means they are not cash and cash equivalents, but because they are due for maturity within 3 months from the end of the financial year, an entity has presented them as cash and cash equivalents. Now, this is not a correct classification of these fixed deposits because AS3 says that cash and cash equivalent includes deposits with original maturity of less than 3 months. When we talk about disclosure deficiency, now accounting standard 15 requires a detailed disclosure on the actual valuation and other aspects. Now, if that disclosure is missing, so there is a misstatement of disclosure. So the auditor considers not only the quantitative aspect of misstatement while evaluating the audit evidence, forming an opinion, but also considers other factors related to classification, presentation, and disclosure. Then, to conclude whether the auditor has obtained reasonable assurance, the auditor considers whether sufficient appropriate audit evidence has been obtained. So SA 330, auditor's responses to assessed risk or material misstatement, describes in detail what is sufficient appropriate audit evidence. So I'm not going into the details of SA 330, but this is what it means is basically it has to be both sufficient and appropriate to form an audit opinion. Whether uncorrected misstatements are material individually or in aggregate. So this is dealt with SA 450. Now, SA 450, first of all, requires that before you evaluate the material misstatement, whether they are material or not, you need to first reassess the materiality based on your audit findings, that whether the materiality remains appropriate in the context of the audit evidence obtained. So first, the auditor reassesses the materiality and then evaluates all the misstatements which are above the clearly threshold limit and see whether any of the misstatement individually or all the identified misstatements in aggregate are material and of having an effect on the financial statements to be materially misstated. Then the auditor evaluates in the context of applicable financial reporting framework. So we'll discuss in the next slide. So when we say evaluation in the context of applicable financial reporting framework, so first point to consider is qualitative aspects of accounting practices, such as indicators of possible bias in management judgment, accounting policies, that is whether there is adequate disclosure, whether they are consistent with the framework and appropriate. So the auditor basically assesses whether the accounting policy have been correctly chosen and correctly applied. So for example, when we talk about adequate disclosure, so let's say take an example of AS2. So AS2 allows valuation of inventory to be either on FIFO basis or on weighted average basis. So where the company is following FIFO basis and it has not mentioned the basis of valuation, so the disclosure of accounting policy is not there. Similarly, in case of depreciation, whether it is WDV or SLM, it has to be disclosed to make it relevant to the users to understand how the depreciation is being charged in the financial statements. It should be consistent with the framework and appropriate in the circumstances. So when I talk about it should be consistent with the framework, so let us say in case of revenue, so revenue is to be recognized in the context of AS9 when the risk and rewards are transferred. Now, if the accounting policy says that revenue is recognized at the time of dispatch from the premises, now, even though the risk and rewards have not been transferred, so this policy is not consistent with the framework, that is AS9. So the auditor has to evaluate whether the accounting policies have been adequately disclosed and they have been correctly chosen and applied and are consistent with the framework. So all these affects the auditor's opinion. So we will see in subsequent slides how it affects the auditor's opinion. Whether accounting estimates are reasonable, whether the information presented in the financial statements is relevant, reliable, comparable, and understandable, whether there are adequate disclosures to enable the intended users to understand the effect of material transactions and events on the information conveyed in the financial statements. So for example, the company has presented some amount as an exceptional item in the statement of profit and loss. In the absence of adequate disclosure about what this exceptional item pertains to, the users will not be able to understand the effect of the material transaction which has been shown as exceptional item. Similarly, if there are discontinuing operations, the adequate disclosures required to understand how the discontinuing operations have affected the financial statements will not make the financial statements understandable to the users of the financial statements. So continuing with the evaluation in the context of financial reporting framework. So the auditors assesses whether terminology used in the financial statements, including the title of each financial statement, is appropriate. So for example, in case of a corporate entity, the title should be statement of profit and loss. And if the entity uses the title such as income and expenditure account, so this is not a correct terminology that has been used in the financial statements and is not in accordance with the financial reporting framework. Whether the financial statements achieve a fair presentation. To assess this, the auditor assesses the overall presentation, structure, and content. Say, for example, disclosures as per accounting standards and Schedule 3. Whether financial statements, including notes, represent underlying transactions and events in a manner that achieves fair presentation. Adequate reference to or description of applicable financial reporting framework. So when forming an opinion, the auditor should ensure that there is adequate reference to or description of applicable financial reporting framework. So when we talk about financial reporting framework, as I mentioned, so there could be accounting standards issued by the ICAI or companies accounting standard rules or Ind AS. Now, we have noted certain cases where even in the corporate entities, the reference is given to accounting standard issued by the Institute of Chartered Accountants of India. This is not correct. Right. Now, even in the case where the company's accounting standard rules 2006 are followed, the company may be an SMC. So the disclosure of the fact that the company is SMC is essential because SMC is exempt from certain disclosure requirements, right? So auditor has to form the opinion in the context of whether the entity has complied with the disclosure requirements as applicable to an SMC in the context of accounting standards. So I will first come to what are the various types of opinion and then discuss in detail about the types of opinion. So if we look at audit opinion, so audit opinion can be either unmodified or modified. So when we talk of unmodified, that means there are no adverse comments or no comments in the audit report, or at most there is an emphasis of matter. So when we include emphasis of matter and no other qualification is there, so just because there's an emphasis of matter, the audit report does not become modified. So it is unmodified. Emphasis of matter is dealt with SA 706. When we came to modified opinion, it is dealt with SA 705. So the standard talks about 3 types of modifications. So it can be a qualified opinion, it could be an adverse opinion, or a disclaimer of opinion. So simply put, when we are giving an unmodified opinion, we are giving a big thumbs up to the client that everything is okay and the financial statements are true and fair. But when we are giving a modified opinion, we are saying there is something wrong. The financial statements do not represent a complete true and fair view. So there are issues which are addressed by the auditor in his or her auditor's report. So EM can be there along with the qualification, but if there is no qualification, it remains an unmodified opinion. So the modification would depend on the materiality and pervasiveness of the matter. So let us see where the auditor concludes that the financial statements are prepared in all material respects in accordance with the financial reporting framework, the auditor issues an unmodified opinion. Right. Now, under what circumstances there is a qualified opinion? So there are 2 circumstances under which there would be a qualified opinion. So when the auditor has obtained sufficient appropriate audit evidence and concludes that the misstatements, either individually or in aggregate, are material but not pervasive to the financial statements, or there could be a situation where the auditor is unable to obtain sufficient appropriate audit evidence and has concluded that the possible effects on the financial statements on undetected misstatements, if any, could be material but not pervasive, right? So let me explain the concept of pervasive. So pervasive means could be 3 scenarios. One, that it is not restricted to a single item or single element of the financial statements, or it could be restricted to or confined to a single line item or a single element, but its magnitude is such that it affects the financial statement as a whole, or the disclosures are deficient and which are necessary for the, which are fundamental for the users to understand the financial statements. So let us take an example. So where, let's say, there are misstatements identified in inventory, trade receivables, loans given, and trade payables. So there are misstatements in 4 to 5 financial statement areas. So it is a pervasive thing, because when your inventory is qualified, your debtors are qualified, your creditors are qualified, your loans and advances are qualified. So there are misstatements in these areas. So these are affecting a number of line items in the financial statements. The second example could be inventory constitutes 80% of my total assets, and the auditor has concluded that inventory is materially misstated because there is a significant decline in the net realizable value and it is continued to be valued at cost. Now, if my inventory is misstated, obviously my cost of goods sales is also misstated. So the amount of misstatement in inventory is pervasive enough in the financial statement because it constitutes 80% of my total assets. And if we talk about disclosures, so maybe the material uncertainty relating to going concern, now the factors why the material uncertainty is there and what is the management's plan to mitigate those uncertainties is not there. So it is fundamental for the users to make an economic decision. So this is also an example of pervasiveness. So when the misstatement is material but not pervasive. So for example, the company has not carried out an actual valuation to determine its gratuity liability and accounts for it on a cash basis. So this is not pervasive because it is limited to employee benefits and provisions, right? So it is a qualification matter. Amount can be material because considering the number of employees. So it has to be included in the audit report as a qualified opinion. Or in the second example, when the auditor is not able to obtain sufficient appropriate audit evidence, maybe has not been able to attend the physical verification of inventory, but the inventory is not material to the financial statements. So maybe the auditor can give a qualified opinion. When we come to adverse opinion, now adverse opinion is when the auditor has obtained sufficient appropriate audit evidence and has concluded that the misstatements individually or in the aggregate are both material and pervasive to the financial statement. So we discussed the examples where 4-5 line items are materially misstated. So in this case, the auditor gives the statement that the financial statements do not give a true and fair view. Disclaimer of opinion. So here the auditor says, I am not able to form an opinion. Now, under what circumstances? So primarily, the most common case is that the auditor is unable to obtain sufficient appropriate audit evidence on which to base an audit opinion and has concluded that the possible effects on the financial statements of undetected misstatements could be both material and pervasive. So under what circumstances, for example, this can happen is maybe there has been a fire in the premises and all the accounting records have been destroyed, or there has been a search and seizure and all the books of accounts have been seized by the tax authorities and not available for audit. So in these circumstances, the auditor has not been able to obtain sufficient appropriate audit evidence. Or there could be scope limitation where management is not allowing the auditor to perform procedures on various financial statement areas, and the auditor is also not able to perform alternate procedures, and therefore has been able to conclude that opinion cannot be formed. So appendix to SA 705, application guidance to SA 705 has summarized these types of opinion into a table which I have reproduced. So financial statements are material statement. Only material, it's qualified. Material and pervasive is adverse. Inability to obtain sufficient appropriate audit evidence. Only material, it's qualified. Both material and pervasive, it's a disclaimer of opinion. So if there are any questions, you can type in the chat box and I will take it up at the end of the presentation as per the format of this program. So now let us look at the structure of the audit report. Now SA 700 has prescribed a structure of audit report. It is specific in nature, and the sequence of the various headings, various matters to be included in the audit report are in a particular order. And this has been done to ensure comparability of audit report across sectors and across industries or various audit reports. So let us look at what the structure of an audit report looks like. So the first thing is the auditor's report shall be in writing. And when I say in writing, it means whether it is in hard copy or an electronic document, but it has to be something which is written and not oral. The second element of the audit report is title. So title means that the audit report clearly indicates that it is the report of an independent auditor. Addressee. The auditor's report shall be addressed as appropriate based on the circumstances of the engagement. So, for example, in the case of companies, audit of financial statement carried out in accordance with the Companies Act, then the audit it is addressed to the members of the company. After the addressee comes the opinion paragraph. This includes the auditor's opinion. Where it is an unmodified opinion, it just says opinion. However, where the opinion is modified, the heading changes to either qualified opinion or adverse opinion or disclaimer opinion, as the case may be. After the opinion paragraph comes basis of opinion paragraph. Now this has to be included even in case of unmodified opinion. So wherein in an unmodified opinion, the auditor states that we have carried out the audit in accordance with the applicable standards in auditing and we complied with ethics and independence requirements. So there is a standard format which is given in SA 700. But where the opinion is modified, the auditor has to explain the factors leading to the modification of the audit opinion in the basis of qualified opinion or the basis of adverse opinion or the basis of disclaimer opinion, as the case may be. So for example, if we talk about a qualified opinion wherein the entity has not carried out an actual valuation in accordance with AS 15, so under the basis of opinion paragraph, the auditor would include a statement: the entity has not carried out an actual valuation to determine its employee benefit obligation in respect of gratuity, which is not in accordance with accounting standard 15 employee benefits. Right. So this will be the basis of qualified opinion. Going concern. Now, this is a separate section that is included in the auditor's report. Now, it is not included in all cases. Now, the auditor has to comply with the provisions of SA 570 revised, which is related to going concern. Now, only when there is a material uncertainty related to going concern, but based on the audit procedures and evidence gathered, the auditor concludes that the going concern basis of accounting is appropriate. That is, a material certainty exists, but going concern basis of accounting is appropriate, and there are adequate disclosures in the financial statements regarding the material uncertainty. Then a separate section titled Material Uncertainty related to going concern is included in the auditor's report. However, in accordance with SA 570, where the auditor decides to either give a qualified opinion or an adverse opinion, this paragraph is not included, and it is included as a part of opinion paragraph and basis of opinion paragraph, that is qualified opinion or adverse opinion, and a description is given in the basis of qualified opinion or a basis of adverse opinion, as the case may be. Next element is emphasis of matter paragraph. This is treated in accordance with SA 706. We will look at some of the key requirements of SA 706 in a later slide. Then is key audit matters, which is primarily for listed entities or in certain cases other entities. So this again is as per SA 701. Again, we will look at key points related to SA 701 in a subsequent slide. The next section is responsibilities of the management and those charged with governance for the financial statements. So we will look at this, what is included in this paragraph in a later slide. Then comes the auditor's responsibilities for the audit of the financial statements. Again, we will have a look at what all is included in this paragraph in the audit report in a subsequent slide. Then is other reporting responsibility, for example, report on other legal and regulatory requirements as per the requirements of Companies Act, so section 143.3 and 143.11, because CARO disclosures. So that all forms part of other reporting responsibilities. The next element is signature of the auditor. Now, the elements under the signature of the auditor are name of the firm registration number, name of the partner or proprietor, membership number of the partner or proprietor. The next element is UDIN, Unique Document Identification Number, as required by ICAI guidelines. So strictly speaking, UDIN has not been mentioned in SA 700, but because I am covering the overall structure of the audit report and it is mandatory to quote UDIN in the audit report, so I have included it in my presentation. A word of caution in UDIN. So recently, on 17 September, the Council of the Institute has come out with the amendment that the UDIN now can be generated within 60 days from the date of audit report to align with the requirement of SQC1, which requires archival of files to be done in 60 days. So the earlier requirement was 15 days. However, if you read the notification that has been issued by the ICAI, it clearly states that where a regulator requires the UDIN to be generated immediately or within a specified period, the member shall generate and upload the UDIN in accordance with the relevant regulator's requirement. So it is not a blanket extension of time period to generate UDIN. So far as CBDT is concerned, it is still 15 days. So if you are filing tax audit reports and you fail to generate UDIN within 15 days because CBDT requires 15 days, the tax audit report becomes invalid. So this is a caution that has to be exercised. Then the place of the signature and the date of auditor's report. Now, place and date of auditor's report can be different from the place and date of the management's place and date. Obviously, the date of auditor's report will be either same or later to the date of management's report. So you can have a dual date and place in the financial statements, but suppose the financial statements are being signed in Mumbai and the auditor is signing the report in Delhi. So the financial statement should also, have a separate place and date column for the auditor's signature and a separate for the management signature. And because you cannot have a situation where the financial statements say place of signing is Mumbai and the auditor's report signing at Delhi. So auditor has signed in Delhi. So both places it should be mentioned Delhi. So we come to the management responsibility. So the management responsibility very clearly says that it is a management responsibility to prepare the financial statements in accordance with the applicable financial reporting framework. That is, whether it is Ind AS or Companies Accounting Standard 2006 or the standards issued by ICAI, and as applicable SMC, non-SMC, level 1, level 2, level 3, level 4. The next management responsibility is to design, implement, and maintain such internal control as management determines is necessary to enable the preparation of financial statements that are free from material misstatement, whether due to fraud or error. Again, it is the management's responsibility to assess the entity's ability to continue as a going concern and whether the use of going concern basis of accounting is appropriate. So the auditor should refer to the guidance given in SA 570 to assess whether the management has performed this assessment correctly or not correctly. Now we come to the auditor's responsibilities. So auditor clearly mentions that it is a reasonable assurance. So I have explained that a reasonable assurance is not an absolute assurance, that the financial statements as a whole are free from material misstatement, whether due to fraud or error. Then the auditor states that the auditor uses professional judgment and professional skepticism. The auditor should describe the audit. So basically it requires that the auditor has identified and assessed risk of material misstatement, whether due to fraud and error, that the auditor designs and performs procedures which are responsive to risk of material misstatement. The auditor's responsibility is to obtain sufficient appropriate audit evidence And the auditor is responsible for understanding internal controls relevant to the audit in order to design audit procedures that are appropriate in the circumstances. So this paragraph we will look at slightly in detail the requirement of internal controls in a subsequent slide. But the auditor, generally understand internal controls to design the extent of the substantive procedures that are required to be carried out. Then the auditor's responsibility include evaluation of appropriateness of accounting policies that we have discussed in detail. Then the auditor is supposed to conclude on the management's assessment of going concern, again in accordance with SA 570. Then the audit report requires a statement that the auditor has communicated with those charged with governance. Right, this is described in detail in SA 260, but the matters that are to be included in the audit report are that the auditor has communicated the planned scope and timing of the audit, has communicated significant audit findings, including any significant deficiencies in internal control identified in the audit. So when we talk about significant deficiency in internal controls, so it is dealt by SA 265. Then the auditor has communicated with those charged with governance about the compliance with relevant ethical requirements regarding independence. So all these matters are included in the auditor's responsibility on the audit of financial statements paragraph as prescribed by SA 700. Let me come to some special consideration of common errors that are noticed in the case of auditor's report on corporate entities. Now, this is particular reference to reporting under section 143.3. So I have not reproduced all the subclauses of section 143.3. So only certain clauses where the errors are mostly found in the audit report I have tried to cover. So subclause A, it requires whether he has sought and obtained all the information and explanations which to the best of his knowledge and belief were necessary for the purpose of his audit, and if not, the details thereof and the effect of such information on the financial statement. So even where the audit report is qualified or there's an adverse opinion, this paragraph is not suitably modified in many cases. So once you are giving a qualification based on inability to obtain sufficient appropriate evidence, either qualification or adverse opinion, then this has to be modified accordingly. Now, whether in his opinion proper books of account as required by law have been kept by the company so far as appears from his examination of those books, and proper returns adequate for the purpose of his audit have been received from branches not visible. So again, the auditor has to assess whether he has been provided with all the proper books of account that have been required by law have been maintained. So there are certain clauses in CARO, the company is required to maintain cost records, even that would cover in the proper books of account. So if the company is not maintaining cost records, then the auditor will have to modify this reporting under subclause B of 143.3. Then we come to 143.3E. Whether in his opinion the financial statements comply with the accounting standards. Now, I have come across multiple financial statements, where the accounting policy states that the company follows a cash basis of accounting for gratuity liability, or the company is not required to do an actual valuation. I'm talking about company, because the number of employees are less than 50, or it has not been in existence for 5 years. Now, this is a clear violation of accounting standard 15, but the disclosure is there in the accounting policy, but there is no modification to this clause in the auditor's report. A common omission, whenever there are observations or comments, the auditor has to mention whether these have any adverse effect on the functioning of the company. Most of the time, auditors fail to include reporting under this clause. And similarly, clause H, where any qualification, reservation, or adverse remark relating to maintenance of accounts and other matters connected therewith. So a lot of times, this clause is not reported upon, even though they are qualifications or an adverse opinion. And lastly, whether the company has adequate internal financial control system in place and the operating effectiveness of such control. So this I will discuss in the next slide. There are two places where the auditor is required to comment on IFC reporting. One is in the auditor's responsibility paragraph and also in 143(3)(I). So in case IFC reporting is applicable and the auditor is giving an opinion under 143(3)(I), so the auditor should suitably modify the auditor's responsibility section. So I have underlined the portion which says we are also responsible for expressing our opinion on whether the company has adequate internal financial controls with reference to financial statements in place and the operating effectiveness of such control. And where the reporting under 143(I) is not applicable either to a corporate entity or in case of non-corporate entities, the auditor's responsibility paragraph should be modified to say, but not for the purpose of expressing an opinion on the effectiveness of company's internal financial controls. So there have been instances, where there is a reporting under 143(I), but the auditor responsibility says, but not for the purpose of expressing an opinion, and vice versa. So let's look at some of the specific considerations related to 705. So SA 705 very clearly says that an inability to perform a specific procedure does not constitute a limitation or scope of audit if the auditor is also able to obtain sufficient approved evidence by performing alternate procedure. So for example, you are not able to send balance confirmations to a trade receivable. However, this alone will not result in a limitation provided you are able to perform alternate procedures such as subsequent collections from the trade receivable or a build-up testing and tracing the dispatch documents and actual delivery of goods to verify whether letters are actually genuine. So you cannot take a shelter that I have not been able to send confirmation. So I am giving a disclaimer of opinion because it's a scope limitation. Where the management imposes limitation on the auditor to perform certain audit procedures, it will require the auditor to reassess the risk of fraud and also consider whether he is to continue the engagement or withdraw from the engagement. Obviously, there are considerations the law which has to be considered whether he can withdraw or not, but we'll have to evaluate this. It says that unless required by a law or regulation, where there's a disclaimer of opinion, the auditor's report shall not include a key audit matter section in accordance with SA 701 or on other information section in accordance with SA 720 revised. And very important part, where the auditor expects to modify the opinion in the auditor's report, whether it is an adverse opinion or a qualified opinion or a disclaimer of opinion, the auditor should communicate with those charged with governance well in advance and explain the circumstances that will lead to the expected modification and the wording of the modification. When there is a disclaimer of opinion, the opinion paragraph changes as we were engaged to audit the accompanying financial statements of ABC Company Limited. So, and the basis of disclaimer of opinion paragraph would start as we do not express an opinion on the accompanying financial statements because of the significance of the matter described in the basis for disclaimer of opinion section of our report. Some consideration related to emphasis of matter. So emphasis of matter is basically a paragraph which is included in the auditor's report that refers to a matter appropriately presented or disclosed in the financial statement, but in the judgment of the auditor is of such importance that it is fundamental to the user's understanding of the financial statements. For example, there is a material litigation. So the auditor may draw attention to a detailed note in the financial statement regarding the litigation. Emphasis of matter has to be a separate section in the auditor's report. We have seen in the structure of the audit report. The auditor emphasis of matter paragraph has to include a clear reference to the matter being emphasized, and where relevant disclosures can be found in the financial statement. So it has to be, we draw attention to a note number so and so regarding such matter. It has to be very clear. So it cannot be a very open kind of a emphasis of matter. And it shall refer only to the information which is presented or disclosed in financial statements. So whatever has not been presented or disclosed in financial statements cannot be a subject matter of emphasis of matter. And in the emphasis of matter paragraph, the auditor should clearly mention that the audit opinion is not modified. So here I would like to take a minute. So there has to be a distinction between modification and qualification. Qualification is only a subset of modified opinion. So a lot of clients insist on using the word our audit opinion is not qualified. So this is not actually a correct statement to make. It should be audit opinion is not modified. So you have to actually discuss with the client and explain the requirements of SA 705, that qualification is only one part of modification. So the correct terminology is modified and not qualified. Some other considerations. An inclusion of emphasis of matter paragraph does not affect the auditor's opinion. So we discussed it is not a modification. It is just the emphasis of matter that is already present in the financial statements. EOM paragraph is not a substitute for, this is important, a modified opinion in accordance with SA 705. So a very classic example, there is a disclosure in the financial statements which says that the debtors or trade receivable are subject to confirmation and reconciliation, and the auditor happily draws an emphasis of matter that we refer to note so and so regarding trade receivable being subject to confirmation and reconciliation. Now, if the trade receivable is subject to confirmation and reconciliation, and this auditor has not been able to obtain sufficient appropriate audit evidence, it is a matter of modification to audit report, whether qualification or adverse. It cannot be routed through emphasis of matter by drawing attention to a note in the financial statement. So this is a very common mistake that happens at times. It is not a substitute for disclosing the financial statements that the applicable financial reporting framework requires management to make, or that are otherwise necessary to achieve fair presentation. So, the emphasis of matter paragraph should not include the disclosures that the management should have given in the financial statements. And it is not a substitute for reporting in accordance with SA 570 when a material uncertainty exists relating to events or conditions that may cast significant doubt on an entity's ability to continue as a going concern. So, prior to SA 570 being revised, going concern could have been addressed through emphasis of matter paragraph, but now since last 4 years, SA 570 has been revised. So there are specific reporting requirements described under SA 570. So any matter related to going concern has to be in accordance with the requirements of SA 570 and not SA 706 as far as going concern is concerned. Key audit matters. These are the matters that in the auditor's professional judgment were of most significance in the audit of financial statements of the current period. So these are the matters selected from the matters communicated with those charged with governance. So we discussed earlier that the SA 260 requires that the auditor to communicate what are the significant focus areas of the audit, And from those matters which have been communicated to those charged with governance, the auditor selected certain key matters which are to be included in a separate section in the audit report under the head key audit matters. So SA 701's applicability, it is primarily, it is applicable on complete sets of general purpose financial statements, listed entities, or where the auditor decides to include KM. So if the auditor decides to include KM in a non-listed entity, the presentation and inclusion of KM should be in accordance with SA 701. Or there may be cases where the auditor is required by law or regulation to disclose key audit matters. Again, in such a case, disclosure has to be as per the requirements of SA 701. A similar consideration that we discussed for emphasis of matter paragraph applied to key audit matters also, that it is not a substitute for a modified opinion in accordance with SA 705. It is not a substitute for disclosure in the financial statements that the applicable financial reporting framework requires management to make, or it is not a substitute for reporting in accordance with 570. So the concepts are similar to what are applicable to emphasis of matter paragraph. And a very important matter, the inclusion of CAM is not a separate opinion on the individual matters. So you may have CAM related to maybe contingent liabilities or capital work in progress or trade receivables. It is only to highlight that these were the critical areas where the auditor's attention was more than other areas and what the procedures were performed. It is not an opinion on individual elements such as trade receivables or contingent liability. The audit opinion is on the financial statements as a whole and given in the opinion paragraph. Some issues thought I should cover. So if we look at auditor's report under Form 3CB, so Form 3CB has basically two parts. One is a report on the financial statements and the other is the report on Form 3CDN and annexes thereto. So far as Form 3CB is concerned on financial statements, although there is no option to change the format and layout in tax audit report, the paragraphs related to auditor's responsibility and management responsibility should be included in observation and comment section to ensure compliance with SA 700. In case financial statements are prepared on liquidation basis as going concern basis is not appropriate, the SA 570 requires that the auditor may be able to perform an audit of financial statement provided the auditor determines that other basis of accounting is acceptable in the circumstances. In such a case, the auditor may be able to express an unmodified opinion provided there is adequate disclosure therein about the basis of accounting on which the financial statements are prepared. However, the auditor may consider it appropriate or necessary to include an emphasis of matter paragraph in the audit report. So thank you very much. We're happy to take any questions.
Yes, sir. There are 2-3 questions.
Yes, sir.
So the first one is auditor signature and stamp required on all pages of the audit report?
Ideally, stamping and initial on all audit pages is recommended to establish the authenticity of the audit report, that it has been actually signed by the audit firm. Otherwise anybody can replace the page because all pages are not on letterhead generally, right? So stamping gives more authenticity to the audit report.
Okay, sir. Can auditor issue revised audit report if find material mistake at a later point?
So there are specific guidelines issued by the institute under what circumstances the audit report can be modified, revised. So primarily, there's a separate guidance note available on this. So I think that will be a detailed discussion. So we can get back to the members if required later on.
Yes. So very one question is difference between true and fair value and true and correct value.
That's actually a very difficult question, but so when we let me try to explain it. So, true and fair is a much wider view as compared to true and correct view. So, if I say true and correct, so as on balance sheet date, let's say debtors are stated at 100 rupees, right? And so that is a true and correct view. But when I go to true and fair presentation, then I would probably, if subsequently I find that debtor has gone bankrupt, right? And I have not finalized the balance sheet, so I may need to record provision. So that would be a fair presentation, right? So it is giving a true that debtors are there 100 rupees, but it is not fair because I know that the debtors have now become doubtful, and I should, or it has been gone to NCLT, and I may not be able to recover. So it will not be a fair presentation. So true and fair is much wider than true and correct. So I hope I've been able to explain this to some extent with a very simple example.
Fine, sir, fine. If it is a static amount, that is the fixed amount, if we know the amount of the debtors, then that means it is a fair and correct view.
Yeah, it's a fair.
If debtors are not determinable, that means provision is there, then it is true and fair.
And another very good example could be a going concern. So maybe on the balance sheet date, entity is going concern, right? But subsequent to the period, there have been major losses, and their company has defaulted in the loans, and maybe some industry, say a liquor industry, and some state has introduced prohibition, and the company is out of business subsequently. So if I don't take the impact of these events in the financial statement or disclose, even if not taking the impact, if I don't disclose, it will not give a true and fair view. But otherwise, it is giving a true and correct view. Because those events are not, as on 31st March 2021, company is going concern. So it is a true and correct view. So, I mean, true and fair is wider, and true and correct is, slightly more narrow concept.
Fine, sir. Fine, sir. Fine, sir. Can internal auditing standards be applied by auditors along with the auditing standards while conducting statutory audit and vice versa?
No, I think audit and assurance engagements have to be complied with strictly in accordance with the standards and auditing issued by the Institute of Chartered Accountants of India. And internal auditing standards are totally different. And as of now, to my understanding, these are still recommendatory and not mandatory. So internal auditor, may draw some guidance if you want to. If the standards on auditing are not clear on some aspect, and some guidance is available, yes, maybe refer it, but audit has to be in accordance with standards in auditing.
Yes, fine, sir. Assuming a situation, sir, where an auditor is not getting any accounts and documents from a private limited company for audit, what would be the remedies for auditor? Is auditor liable to issue audit report?
I think in this case, the auditor should first of all establish contact with those charged with governance within a private company would be the directors and the management, and then take adequate steps to ensure that at a later date auditor is not found guilty of not carrying an audit, and auditor should actually consider withdrawing from the engagement because without the subject matter you cannot perform an audit actually.
Yes, sir. So what are the true tests to ascertain the concept of going concern by statutory audit as required due to the changes in the Companies Act 2013 with effect from April 2021?
Can you repeat the question?
What are the true tests to ascertain the concept of going concern by the stat auditor as required due to the changes in Companies Act 2013 with effect from April 2021?
So, what I understand is Companies Act has amended Schedule 3. So, there are certain ratios have to be given, and also the CARO 2020 has been modified to assess the ability to repay its liabilities. Right. So, going concern, the responsibility of the auditor was always there under 570. It's a mandatory standard in auditing. So maybe certain additional disclosures have been required as per CARO or Schedule 3. SS 570 was always mandatory, and the auditor has. In any case, if we see auditor's report, it requires a specific comment that the auditor is responsible for assessing the management assessment of going concern. right?
Yes.
So that assessment of going concern was always there and is mandatory in nature. So, you know, wherever there are indicators, auditor has to assess irrespective of what Companies Act says or not.
Thank you, sir. These were the few questions for your deliberation. And frankly speaking, it was a wonderful deliberation, sir. Very explanative. Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you, sir.
And on behalf of CMP of ICA, once again, I thanks, heartiest thanks for sparing your valuable time.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.